Rabbi.
Okay, well, we finished the laws of we finished laws of Yom Tov last week, so we're going to go to chapter 140, Kuf Mem, chapter 140, and it's Purim, right? So we're going to we're actually going to summarize 140, so we get stuck into 141, which is actually Purim proper. So in chapter 140, so Code of Jewish Law, Bridge Code of Jewish Law, Siman Kuf Mem, chapter 140, are the four special parshas, four special Torah readings. So the first one is last week. So we're learning about it
Not last week.
post operation over here.
Yesterday.
Yes, last Shabbos, right? So Parsha Shkolim. So Parsha Shkolim is always read on either. So if Rosh Chodesh Adar, if the first day of Adar falls out on Shabbos, so they coincide, Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, then we read it on Rosh Chodesh itself, on the Shabbos. If, like this year, Rosh Chodesh is a weekday, then we read it on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh. And Parsha Shkolim, which speaks about the half shekel, the mitzvah that everyone would give a half shekel to, it went towards communal fund for the communal offerings, right? Because the communal offerings, every Jew had to own a portion, had to be from every Jew. So how does every Jew own the communal offering? Is that everyone contributed towards a fund, and the communal offerings were purchased from that fund. So every Jew was a co-owner in the communal offerings. A lot of lessons we can take from. We're not going to go in depth, but why a half shekel coin? Every Jew on the owners only half without being part of the community. There's lots of things that we can learn. But it was they started collecting it on Rosh Chodesh Adar, the beginning of Adar, because the new year's fund would start to be used on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, right, in a month's time. So they started collecting in Israel, at least. Outside of Israel, they would collect sometimes even earlier, so it could make it to Israel on time. But in Israel, they started collecting this month in advance. They put out the announcements, and people went out with the certain messages, who went out with collection boxes. And anyway, so they gave the half shekel. So since that was done at this time of year, we read about this time of year. It's a time where the gates, spiritual gates, are open for blessings of wealth. It's also a time since we daven in place of the kabbonos, the offerings on the Beis Mikdash. It's a time where we can daven, we can have great blessings for our davening. Okay, but it was last week. It was last Shabbos, yesterday. The next one coming up, special Parsha number 2 or 4, is Parshas Zocher. Now, Parshas Zocher is one of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah to read Parshas Zocher once every 12 months. So just to give a bit of a background, one of the first rabbinical enactments, one of the first rabbinical decrees made was Moshe. Moshe made himself decreed that we should read the Torah every Shabbos. Now, the actual what they read is not the same as what we read today. What we read today was from Ezra, at least based on what Ezra put into place, which was at the building of the second temple, second Beis Mikdash. But Moshe decreed that we should read something from the Torah every Shabbos. So although it was from biblical times, it's actually from the times of the 5 books of Moses itself, but it's still a rabbinical enactment because it's not one of the 613 mitzvahs that Hashem gave us. It's something that Moshe instituted himself, him and the Sanhedrin of the time, the initial Sanhedrin instituted. So Torah should be familiar to everyone everyone's busy during the week and come on Shabbos and can hear the Torah, and it makes this connection. So generally speaking, the Torah reading that we have is rabbinic. Doesn't make it not important. It's still very important. We should try and hear the Torah read every Shabbos if we can. But Parshas Zachor, this reading about Amalek, and we'll get into that a little bit, exactly who, what, when, where. But this particular piece of the Torah, one of the 613 mitzvahs is to read this, to read it or hear it be read every 12 months, at least once every 12 months. So Amalek, of course, was this nation that attacked us when we left Egypt. Amalek is a unique type of anti-Semite. Most anti-Semites, if they know you're going to beat them, they're not going to start. Or if you bribe them, you're of some use to them, so they're also not going to start. But Amalek is willing to kill itself in order, the spiritual origin of Amalek. I think we discussed this once in the past, but just bear in mind, where did Amalek come from? Amalek was the favorite grandson of Esau. Right? So we know that Esau hated his brother Yaakov, and Esau used to have his little grandson on his lap, spending quality Zayda grandchild time. Those of us grandchildren should think about this very carefully. And instead of telling him nice, sweet stories, he used to tell him how much he hates his brother, how much he hates Yaakov. And Yaakov cheated him. And he hates Yaakov, and he hates everything he represents, and he hates his kids, and and he just wished he could kill him, And one day, his sweet little grandson, who just loved his Zaidi so much, looked up to him and says, "Don't worry, Zaidi, I'll get them for you." And that was the birth of Amalek. But you can see the power of influence that grandparents can have. I mean, God forbid this was for the negative. But, if we can have that kind of influence of the negative, how much more so we can have an influence of the positive. So, it's very important, when my grandkids come in, I always sing, the Torah Tzivin, Torah. It's cute. Takes about 30 seconds, but it means that my grandchildren are going to associate me with that, right? Zayd is where Torah comes from, so it's just not a bad idea. Maybe those who have grandchildren can maybe start doing that or something like that. So Amalek, just on a irrational level, wants to wipe us out. So of course we have we read about the mitzvah to remember what they did to us, and that we should essentially wipe them out before they wipe us out. Without getting too sidetracked, it seems a very odd thing to read. I mean, for thousands of years we have no idea who Amalek is. I mean, true, if we were all in a room together and someone would walk into that room and we knew for a fact that they were from Amalek, we would all have a mitzvah to kill them on the spot. You might go to jail for killing them. Well, people went to jail in Russia for eating matzah. It's just self-sacrifice of mitzvahs. But you have to know for a fact they're from Amalek. If you even have the smallest doubt, then it could be murder. Amalek is like a self-defense, it's a preemptive strike. But if you don't know they're from Amalek, maybe, they're just regular anti-Semitic or whatever it is. You can't just go killing people without a valid reason. And so it's a mitzvah that really hasn't been practically relevant for, getting close to 3,000 years. So if you had to pick a mitzvah in the Torah, like a section of the Torah to make it a mitzvah to read, you would think maybe we should read Shema. Maybe we should read the Seres Dibros, the so-called Ten Commandments. Maybe we should read about creation. I mean, surely, if you're going to pick a piece of the Torah that was a commandment to read every day, or every year, why would it be about Amalek? First of all, why that mitzvah? And then second of all, because it's not even relevant nowadays. We can't do anything about it. And the reasoning behind it is that it's not just on a simple level, the people Amalek. We're also looking at it from a spiritual perspective. Amalek is connected to the spiritual source of apathy, of cooling off enthusiasm for holiness. The greatest enemy of Judaism is apathy. If you have people who care and they're passionate, even if it's about the wrong thing, they're passionate about everything that's wrong, everything that's not important, but at least they have a passion in them. And perhaps at a later time, that passion can be redirected to something positive. But apathy, that's just something, it's the absolute enemy of spiritual growth. Person can't grow. They're just going through the motions. And it's not just the physical Amalek that we have a mitzvah of preemptive strike, which isn't relevant to us today. It's the spiritual Amalek. It's apathy, coldness, the opposite of enthusiasm. That we have a mitzvah to remember, and we have a mitzvah to wipe that out within ourselves as individuals. That we should instead have a passion and a fire in the belly. We should have a drive and not just go through the motions. Right? That's really the importance of the reading about Amalek. So, as I said, the mitzvah of the Torah is to hear it at least once every 12 months. It could be any time. But the sages instituted that we should read it the Shabbos before Purim. The Shabbos before Purim, of course, Purim, the enemy of the Purim story is Haman, who was from Amalek. And Purim is the downfall of Amalek. They lost. And so we put this reading together with the downfall of Amalek. So that's why we read that one. And according to all opinions, that is one of the 613 mitzvahs to read about Amalek. The third of the four special parshas, four special Torah readings, is Parshas Porah. This speaks about the red heifer. It's a whole process of someone who's come in contact with a deceased Jew, come in contact with the corpse, of how they become tohu. I don't want to call it spiritually pure or impure because it's in this context a bit of a poor translation. We use it for lack of better translation, but essentially how to become pure. So this is always read the Shabbos before the fourth one. So we'll come to the date in a moment. Let's talk about why do we read it. So for those who are familiar, just a quick revision. Wherever there's life or potential for life, and that life or potential goes, it leaves a spiritual void. That void gets filled with a different type of spiritual energy, which is called tumah. Often translated as impure, and that is sometimes a good translation, but it's not necessarily, because if we just look at taking care of the needs of the deceased is a great mitzvah. Nothing negative comes out of a mitzvah. So if someone would, let's say they were a member of the Chavra Kadisha, particularly when it's a volunteer, not a paid position, it's just the ultimate kindness. Because normally when you do kindness for a person, even if you're being altruistic, you don't expect anything back. The fact is, in the back of your mind, if I do a favor for you today, you can do a favor for me tomorrow. But when one takes care of the needs of the deceased, they're not doing any favors back. This is pure kindness absolute truthful kindness. There's nothing that one can get in return. And it's not something that people want to do. I don't think there's anyone who wakes up in the morning and says, well, what do I want to do today? Well, I want to wash a deceased body. No one, it's something that people don't want to do, but it's something that people do because it's important, and to be able to allow that person to go, the body can go to the next stage in the best way possible, to be buried with a tahara, a proper Jewish burial. So it's something that someone does altruistically, and it's a great mitzvah. Nothing negative can come out of a mitzvah like that. So tumah being translated as impure is really not really the right word. Now, I think we did discuss this once before. We were talking about, we used a parable, in the power outlets in your house in America, they're 110 volts. That's 110 volts comes out. In Australia, it's 240 volts. So which system is better? Well, obviously come from Australia, say Australian system is better, right? But the reality is they both have advantages and disadvantages relative to the other one. Right? There's advantages, disadvantages. So they're both great. They both have it. Each one has an advantage the other one doesn't have. Each one has a disadvantage the other one doesn't have. But the real issue is not compatible. If you take an Australian appliance that's designed to run on 240 volts and you plug it into the wall in America and it's getting 110 volts, it won't work. And if you take a appliance that is designed to run on 110 volts and you plug it into the wall at 240 volts, it catches on fire or blows up. I've done it. That was the end of that stereo. But that's what happens. So it's not necessarily that one is better or worse, it's they're not compatible. Tahara or tohu, pure for lack of better translation, is the spiritual system of life. And tumah, again often translated as impure, is the spiritual system of death. Now, both have a place in this world, but they're not compatible. This is why, the laws of family purity, a child should be conceived whilst in the spiritual state of life. Life should come into a life-bearing system. To be conceived in a state of the spiritual system of death can be spiritually damaging a little bit, or damaging, but an impediment to the spiritual progress of the soul. So whenever there was life or potential for life, this is why, for example, when we go to sleep, so 1/60th, well, in a deep sleep, up to 1/60th, we should say, sometimes less, but up to 1/60th of our part of our soul that's normally clothed in our body leaves. And so we're 1/60th dead, so to speak. And so what happens? It leaves a void. And that void is filled by tumah, by the system of death. And when we wake up, the soul comes back into the body, re-encloses itself into the body, and it pushes that tumah out. And the tumah, as it gets pushed out, ends up in our nails, because the nails are dead. And that's why we need to wash in the morning, wash the negelvasa, wash the water of our hands in the morning to remove this tumah. Kahanim, before they went to Beis Mikdash, even had to wash the tumah, wash their toenails, their feet, to get their toenails. That's why it's even called negelvasa, right? So negelvasa in Yiddish means nail water. A negel is a nail. Okay, we wash our whole hand. We're not going to those laws now, but that's what's behind it. And I think we've mentioned this before. People probably had the experience of having a dream, and they dreamt about somewhere they haven't been or something that didn't happen yet. And they wake up, so you remember the dream, you didn't remember the dream, whatever happens to be. 6 months, 2 years later, whatever happens, whatever it was, what you dreamt happens. Deja vu, they say. How is it possible? How can you dream about a place you haven't been or something happened yet? And this is because when we're in the deep sleep and we have part of our soul, that's our consciousness, leaves our body. Once it leaves our body, it's our soul is spiritual. Spirituality is not contained, is not held by time and space. The laws of physics do not apply to spirituality. When our soul's enclosed in our body, so it's contained by our body, and our body is subject to the laws of physics, so therefore can only be in one time and space at once. But when we're in the deep sleep and this part of our soul leaves our body, it can experience something that didn't happen, that didn't, and that's how deja vu happens. So this system of tumah and tahara, this is again, we just mentioned the laws of family purity. There was potential for life. When a woman has a cycle, there's potential for life, and that potential goes, it leaves a certain void. And in order for the couple to resume relations, to be able to potentially conceive another child, that tumah that came due to the potential, the previous cycle going away, has to be removed via the mikveh. So it's and this is the problem when people translate as impure and pure. It gives a very negative connotation, where it's not negative at all. Life and death are a part of the way the world runs, and it's tumah tahara. As I said, when we're talking about the most extreme tumah, is a deceased Jew. Not only had deceased person, not only you had potential for life, you had actual life in the highest form of life, a human being. So it leaves the greatest void, and therefore the most powerful tumah. And as we said, looking after the needs of the deceased is the greatest mitzvah, and nothing negative comes out of mitzvah. So impurity is really such a poor translation. But a person who is in that spiritual system of death, they can't go to the Beis HaMikdash. They can't go to because the Beis HaMikdash is the system of life. It's not compatible. It's like plugging the American appliance into the Australian outlet. It's going to blow up. Okay, not the person who's going to blow up if he goes to the Beis HaMikdash when he's Tomei, but he's not going to connect spiritually, and it can lead to spiritual damage to himself. So, unfortunately, it was not Jews who translated the Torah into English the first time. It was Christians, and many of their mistranslations or inferior or lacking translations have just been incorporated as the norm, unfortunately. So although the terms pure and pure could work in certain contexts, but the majority of the context doesn't mean that. I believe there's really not a word in English. I would imagine if the Torah had never been translated to English before, an art scroll, whoever was translating for the very first time, I don't believe they would translate it at all. I think they'll just say taho and tomei, and they'd have a footnote explaining the concept, because it's not an appropriate word, and certainly in this context it doesn't mean impure, but it's the system of death. And in order to be able to reconnect back to the system of life after coming in contact with the deceased, there's a seven day process, and we see this 7-day process is associated with death in many ways. The shiva that someone sits, the mourning. There's a lot of this concept of 7, and part of it is it gets sprinkled with the ashes from a totally red calf, really, a year old, and it's one of the ingredients. There's spring water. Anyway, they get sprinkled on the 3rd and 7th day. They go to the mikveh, and this takes them out of the spiritual system of death and reconnects them to the spiritual system of life, and they become tahu, pure, for lack of a better translation. So this is always read before the fourth of the Parshas, the week before. The fourth one, as we'll speak about in a moment, speaks about the Paschal Lamb. But someone who's Tomei cannot bring the Paschal Lamb unless the majority of the Jewish people are Tomei. So what needs to happen is that in order to bring the Paschal Lamb, we need to first become Tohu. So although unfortunately we're not yet able to do that, but hopefully we'll this year, God willing. But until now we haven't been able to. At least we read about it at the time, a week before we start preparing for the Paschal Lamb. Now there is a view that this is also a Torah obligation. And if it is, it's the only two Torah readings that are actual biblical commandment. There's another semi one, right? During the Hakel year, the king would read a certain section of the Torah in the base of Mikdash during Sukkot, but that's a part of the mitzvah of Hakel. It's not like a communal Torah reading, right? These are the only two, about Amalek and about this red heifer. And why is this one again? Why isn't it Shema that's the Torah commandment reading or the creation? Because this speaks about our connection to Hashem. That's number one. And number two, it's a mitzvah which we can't really understand the reasoning behind it. Hashem said don't steal, so we don't steal because Hashem said. But even if Hashem didn't say, we understand you're not meant to steal. You want to have a normal society, you can't steal. But this whole concept of tahor, of tomei, of spiritual system of life, spiritual system of death, we can't see a person, their state. It's not something we can truly, we can understand the logic to a certain extent once Hashem reveals it to us, but it's not something we would have worked out. And then what's sprinkling a red cow, why not a black cow? What's got to do with anything? So it helps us realize the true reason we do mitzvahs. It's not because we understand, although we have a mitzvah to try and understand as much as we can, but it's ultimately because Hashem said. And so that's very important. And the fourth one is always read two possibilities. If Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the first day of the month of Nisan, is Shabbos, then we read it on that day. If, like it's going to be this year, it's a weekday, then we read on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh. And this is the mitzvah of Pesach, essentially. And so therefore we read it right at the beginning of the month where we celebrate Pesach. And these four parshas are very spiritually powerful. They bring along blessings into the world. And there's still 3 to go. So that was chapter 140 in a nutshell. Next week, God willing, we'll start chapter 141 and we'll learn inside. And it's going to be the laws of the Megillah and various things. And so we'll continue that tomorrow, God willing. All right, any questions before we finish up? Okay, all right, well, wish everyone a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you tomorrow, God willing.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take care.
Bye.